Hello, world historians. Today we're going to take the rather drastic step of describing the origins of world civilization. Now, just a quick word, um, taking our lead from Robert Strayer's textbook. This may seem quite a challenge to cover 5,500 years of human history in perhaps 10 minutes, but we have to remember that this is really a drop in the ocean of human history when you consider that biologically modern humans have been around for perhaps a quarter of a million years, to follow the out of Africa school of thought. So what we're talking about here is what we're seeing in the middle of this map here is the Fertile Crescent, so called because it's fertile and shaped like a crescent, although this is somewhat of a oversimplification. Nevertheless, if we focus on the center of the map, you see a region known to the Greeks as Mesopotamia, known to us perhaps as the region centered around the modern day nation state of Iraq, but which was ironically perhaps the cradle of human civilization. Now, this is Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, in this case the Tigris, we see here, and the Euphrates to the west, two great rivers bringing streams of rich mineral deposits from the mountains in the north all the way through regions which today we would consider more or less desert, but which were, as the phrase Fertile Crescent indicates, once very green and capable of supporting agriculture and flowing out into the Persian Gulf. Now, again, the term Mesopotamia is geographical rather than civilizational, by which I mean there were multiple civilizations, the Assyrians, the Sumerians, the Babylonians, many of these wonderful names from the Old Testament. But Mesopotamia simply refers to this region where the beginnings of modern agriculture started to develop perhaps 10,000 years ago after the receding of the last ice age. And you have this area which at the time was quite fertile but has since become desert by means of over farming, exhaustion of the soil, and over irrigation. And you have these rivers which are both a natural boom in terms of providing fertility, but also a great menace because the forces of nature have always been stronger than the forces of civilization. I think we only have to look at some recent natural disasters in the United States to see that that's the case. So in order to develop civilization, what we would call civilization, the leaders of these societies had to develop, God bless them, what we can only describe as the beginnings of modern day politics, which is to say, persuading families, persuading individuals that the greater good perhaps was more important than being able to produce enough food to get through the year. But to actually begin engineering these rivers, to introduce levees, to introduce irrigation canals, to clean out the silt from these canals, requires organization, and it requires politics, which at its most basic level is one group of people, an elite, telling usually a much larger group of people, the population, giving them instructions, perhaps coercing them. But this also leads to the creation of much greater stability, agricultural surplus, and the creation of modern day, modern in a very broad sense, civilization. This term civilization, then, what does it mean? Again, we're looking at an example of culture. I would not necessarily argue that this is an example of high civilization, but it is an object that dates back some 30,000 years, which in terms of archaeological survival is quite extraordinary. This is perhaps ironically referred to as the Venus of Willendorf. And I say ironic because Venus, of course, was a Roman goddess, um, who was named by a civilization which flourished tens of thousands of years after this object was created. So when we look at this artifact, we're looking at distant human history, but we're also, I think, seeing a echo of our own culture and our own civilization. Civilization which, at its best, has always transcended the need simply for survival, for day to day utilitarian application. But this is something which we could describe as art, or perhaps an expression of religion, an expression of transcendent truth. But it's also something that archaeologists, historians have looked at, have scratched their heads, and have said, "What is this?" You know, it's obviously the feminine form, but we don't really know exactly what this is. It's a projection to say that this is a fertility idol or goddess, but this is certainly the interpretation that most historians have placed on it. Similarly, if we fast forward to the year 6000 BCE, or roughly then, we find on the verges of the Fertile Crescent some more perhaps sophisticated stonemasonry. Again, female forms, goddesses created by cultures distantly removed in time and geography from the Venus of Willendorf. But here we're looking at something which again has echoes, I think, of our own culture, although we might look at this as a very crude representation of early religion. But you're talking about here the association with fertility and the feminine mystique. Again, for obvious reasons, the mother gives birth, the ground yields crops, yields agriculture, and ultimately yields civilization. So, to go back to the distinction between culture and civilization, civilization is founded on culture. Culture is any human society, and some people would even argue any mammal or primate society that uses technology to extend its grasp, extend its reach. At its most basic level, we could talk about, for example, chimpanzees and bonobos using sticks to dig termites out of the mound as a form of technology, as a form of culture. But when we come to talk about civilization, we're talking about urbanity, going back to the root of the Latin word civitas, urbanness. We're talking about societies which have politics, which have economic specialization, and which in many cases also have writing. Now, how many of you would even want to attempt to decipher this tablet? This is a cuneiform or written tablet from the early Sumerian Mesopotamian society, some 4,500 years ago. But this is one of the earliest forms of writing. Now, again, very few civilizations have ever independently developed a written system. Mostly it's been a kind of imitation from other societies. So for the Mesopotamians to develop this form of writing, which is referred to as cuneiform or wedge-shaped writing, required a great deal of political and cultural and technological evolution. So this is actually, if you can imagine, written onto obviously the raw materials that were available to this culture. This was a culture which, although it was the Fertile Crescent, there wasn't a great deal of forest. There wasn't a great deal of trees, and therefore no paper. So the actual technology was written on clay bricks, clay tablets that were then baked, and Mesopotamian libraries, if you can imagine such a thing, were literally formed out of these libraries of rows and rows of these clay tablets. Now we're going to take a little bit of a backwards tracing of the development of this form of writing, but you can see that this is even earlier form of written text. pre-cuneiform, if you like, which actually shows that this text originally evolved from what we would call pictograms or visual imagery rather than modern day alphabet or symbolism. But you can see some of the images are identifiable. This chap on the bottom left seems to be either drinking or eating from a bowl, and it's interesting to note that the Mesopotamians, as well as being the earliest, by many accounts, civilization, were also the first people to develop beer and bread, two of the great staffs of life. Now, this is a much later example, actually jumping forward to the Babylonian civilization of Mesopotamian writing. Now, we might ask, here is the text, but what is this illustration? What is this diagram at the bottom? So just take a minute to think about this. This is actually a map of the city of Babylon, showing the two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, running through the center of this city, and the outer edge represents the ocean, and beyond that, the constellations. The Mesopotamian civilizations were great astrologists. They developed the science, the technology that would later be the foundation of modern astronomy. So this is a society with a great sense of technology, a great sense of culture, and this is also, again, a religious rather than a utilitarian object. This map, we think of maps today, we perhaps think of Google Earth. You can see from a satellite in space, look down into your backyard. So we take for granted today the idea that cartography or map making is all about finding where we are in the world. But this has not been the case historically, at least going back to early civilizations. Maps were simply a form of representation. They were a form of narrative, a form of telling our place in the world, but not necessarily how to get there. It's a sense of cosmic time and space. But to go back to the development of writing, it's actually much more mundane, perhaps, much more everyday. And so it's very difficult to imagine that the works of Shakespeare, the works of, the great literature of, the modern world develop directly from something as perhaps uninspiring as these clay tablets. But this is an object which is referred to as an early Mesopotamian bulla, or a kind of capsule. It's literally a clay ball. This was, if you can imagine, getting wet earth, molding it into a capsule, and inside this capsule were these little cuboid or conical tokens, which would be sealed inside, and the exterior would be marked with symbols, again with pictograms that depicted so many heads of livestock, so many bushels of wheat. So this is, in effect, the world's first decanting system. And these capsules would be kept as a kind of transferable record of agricultural produce and, of course, of taxation. And the symbols on the exterior of these bulla would then develop into what we would recognize today as early pictograms, and would be developed into writing. And without writing, of course, the world as we know it today would be impossible. So, again, I think it's important to recognize the connection between writing, civilization, and history. I think this is a great moment in world history where civilizations, for the first time, are able to tell their own stories.